I started there 6 months ago.
Did you have experience in substance abuse counseling before that?
Not really. I'd taken my addictions class and I had my licensed chemical dependency counselor intern license, but I've learned a lot working at the prison. It's not as scary as I first expected it to be.
Really? Even the first day?
Well, I would say the first week was pretty scary. But once I got to know the clients and I kind of got used to having to go through the gate and getting patted down on their random inspections, I kind of just got used to it.
Right. I think that's what happens when people go to prison too. You just get used to it after a while.
Yeah, there's definitely a adjustment period for our clients, especially when this is their first prison experience.
Hopefully their last prison experience, right?
Yeah, every time they leave, I always tell them I hope I never see you again.
Yes, that's the appropriate response. Um, has that been not distracting, but tolling at all working with substance abuse specifically? I mean, I can just imagine the horror stories involved in that. I have some friends that are just local area social workers who work with people in rehab centers and everything, and just some of the stories I've heard from them. It's just it's a little crazy, what that'll do to your life.
Yeah, I think for me, I I understand um, that their addiction kind of took a hold of them, and so their experiences weren't something that they chose. And
Right.
so I'm able to show more compassion than being more shocked, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think that's, as someone who's not involved in those conversations one on one, as someone who doesn't know those people individually and sees them as people, I think it's easier to see it, to almost like demonize it, to where you can't separate the activity from the person and the addiction from the person it has a hold of. I think that's a pretty significant problem that we have culturally, right, where we can't separate the addiction from the person it's taken over.
Definitely. I remember when I first started, I was like, oh my God, I'm working at a prison. This is going to be so scary. I wonder if there's going to be any fights. Um, but then,
Turns out everyone's just hanging out, playing cards and stuff.
I mean, we've had a couple fights, but nothing really too bad. And so I've kind of been able to see them as a person first and with an addiction second. And
Yeah,
so even though, yes, they're in prison, they have a felony, it's not, it doesn't define them as much as people expects it to.
right. And when you look at it that way, I mean, you can apply that to any mental illness situation where it doesn't have to, and that's important for them to know too, that it doesn't define them. If I go up to someone who's addicted to a certain drug and then tell them that or treat them like they're not separate from the addiction that has a hold of them, they're going to identify with that even more. And like I was saying, I think the same is true for any mental health situation or mental illness, where if you don't allow them to identify themselves outside of that problem, then they just will become it and internalize it, and not be able to let go of it and make significant progress. You can tell me if I'm wrong. I'm just saying this is kind of my perspective on it as an unlicensed non-professional, but as someone who's thought about this a little bit.
Yeah, it can be hard because they may not at first even see that they have a problem.
Hmm.
Um,
You mean the
they
addicts that you work with in the prison might not even think that they're addicted, or they might not think it's as serious as it is?
they may not see it as serious as it is. They may say, well, I'm able to have a house, I'm able to have all my bills paid, or they may think that everything is under control or it's not as bad as what it seems to be. And so they're very resistant at first, but then helping them see, how it has actually affected their life, how it's affected the people that they care about, that's usually the point where they start to see that there has been negative consequences in their lives.
Right, right, because they have to come to terms with the consequences that are there, so things don't spiral out of control further in a much more noticeable way from their point of view, perhaps.
Right.
I spoke with I think it was about 3.5 weeks ago. I met a lady who was a serious alcoholic, and it was like damaging and destroying relationships in her lives socially and in her family and in her household. And um, we were talking about that, but her main concern in that was that she didn't know whether she was going to hire someone to clean her house or whether she was going to clean her house. And she kept talking about that. And it was so strange because that was the entire issue, but she was so broken up about it. It was like all the energy that could and should have maybe been devoted to the problems in her life because of the alcoholism. She was focusing on this seemingly minor issue because she couldn't come to terms with what was actually happening around her as a result of her addiction. It's just fascinating what people will do in those situations where they'll just completely divert and completely focus on something else because you can't just focus on nothing when you're sober, at least.
Yeah, and especially depending on what they're addicted to, even just coming off of the substance can be really hard for them as well. There's some where it's really painful to come off. Depending on how much alcohol you've had, you can actually die from if you're had too much alcohol in your system and you're coming off of it cold turkey. There is
Mm.
a chance of you dying from that. And so not everyone always sees the risks that they're taking.
That's so crazy. I didn't know that that was the case with alcohol. I mean, I kind of knew that and or assumed it with like certain hard drugs, like maybe like cocaine or heroin or something. But alcohol, I did not know that you could reach a point where just coming off of it could kill you if there was so much of it in your system. Is it just your body becomes dependent on it, or is it just a lot at once? Like, is it something you would have to do over a sustained period of time and then your body gets used to it and then you take it away and your body freaks out? Or is it like this person has alcohol poisoning, but we kind of have to ease them out of it?
So when you're on a substance, it's messing with your brain chemicals. And so if you stop that all at once, your brain isn't producing those chemicals because it's been supplemented by the substance. And so sometimes when you take it off too quickly, it messes with the brain. And in the case of alcohol, they have what's called DTs, delirium tremens. And it basically, if you get to that point, you have to be medically managed to safely come off of it.
Wow. So it's your brain stops producing certain chemicals under addictions to certain substances, and then maybe you can't function without those chemicals. Is that usually what it comes down to physiologically?
Yeah, and that's why sometimes, like if you're on a stimulant, when you're coming off of it, you'll get really depressed
Right.
because your brain isn't getting those chemicals. And so sometimes when you're coming off of like a depressant, you'll get really anxious because usually the side effects when you're coming off are the opposite of what the effects of the drug were.
Right. And people aren't quick to think, oh, my brain chemistry, and think through this. It's more like, oh, this is how I felt before I took this drug, or this is how I feel without it. So then there's just the tendency immediately to go back to it. It's like people forget that they were okay before, and they become familiar with the state they're in immediately after taking it away. Um, yeah, I think that's a significant part of the problem that perpetuates addiction internally for people in people's minds. It's this familiarity with the self immediately after no longer being intoxicated or high or whatever it is. Hmm.